All right, so it is noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council's webinar on Rev Up the Vote virtual training today. I hope everyone is having a great day. My name is Eric Stoker, and I'm the Information Specialist for the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council, and I'll be your moderator for today. In order for us to have a great presentation today, we're going to mute everyone and keep them muted until the end, when there will be some time for questions. I also want to let everyone know that we are recording this webinar today in order to share it later with those who were unable to attend our webinar today. So for today's topics for this webinar, we're going to talk about why the 2020 vote matters, the importance of the disability vote, how far we've come for people with disabilities to vote since the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. We'll also see what changes there are to voter registrations for 2020, accessible voting requirements and how to make sure you get to vote. And finally, new technology for voting, including the Votes app and how you can use it. So to talk about the topics I mentioned today, I'd like to introduce our panelists for our training today. So we have with us today, we have Eliza Stauffer from the Disability Law Center in Salt Lake City, Utah, Gina Pola-Money from the Legislative Coalition for People with Disabilities, and Seth Anderson from the Utah Lieutenant Governor's Office of Elections. I just wanted to say thank you to these three for taking time out of their busy schedules to come and be a part of this training. Presenters, please introduce yourself and give a brief introduction to your organizations before you start your presentation. Just a reminder. We'll have some time at the end for questions and answers. You can type your questions in the chat during the presentation and we'll try to answer all of them, at the end of this webinar. So with that, I will turn the time over to them and we will start with you, Eliza. Eliza?
Hi, I'm Eliza Stauffer. I work with the Disability Law Center. I work on their voting advocacy team, and I also do employment work with VR, so you might know me from that as well. Can everyone hear me okay? Is my mic working? Fantastic. So I can just start presenting right now. Let me just pull this up. Okay. So please, somebody let me know if this isn't going right. But I just wanted to talk to you guys about some of the work that the DLC is doing and also what you can do. And as Eric said, also cover some voting at home options, as well as other important topics for voting. So the Disability Law Center works under certain grants, and the grant that we do our voting work under is called PAVA, that stands for Protection and Advocacy for Voting Access. We have a bunch of different efforts that include monitoring, stuff like polling sites, poll worker training, and voter communication, complaints such as people experiencing barriers to voting or active discrimination while they're in the process of voting. We do systemic advocacy, which includes legislative work. We work to educate voters so that they know what their rights are and what their options include. And then we also provide technical assistance for both public and other agencies about when, where, and how to vote and how to address any problems. Along with those things and the stuff that we do with legislative, we also use legal avenues such as the Help America Vote Act, also known as HAVA, and the ADA, specifically the access and accommodations portions. So voting has gotten even more complicated than it used to be, and I'm sure it is no surprise to anyone that COVID-19 has impacted a lot of things. So first off, let's talk about the changes that were made for the June 30th primary election. So unlike previous elections, there was no in-person voting. There was no same-day voter registration. There was no early voting there was no early voting, and also all voter registration had to be 11 days prior. These are not necessarily things that we are excited about, but might continue into the November election. And so it's really important to know about things. So there was House Bill 3006 that was passed that required mandatory information about voting accommodations to be posted in public notice, in website, and information with the ballot. However, this expires this month. And so it's expected that there will be some special session of the legislature this month to address voting in November. So all of the information I have is simply about the last election, but I will try to keep our website up to date with new information as we learn it. Some things to know about what happened for this last election was that each county was mandated that they must provide accommodations for voters with print disabilities. The counties had to communicate how to access an accommodation on their website, in public notices, and with the mailed ballot. We would like to see that continue. As I'll get to later on in the presentation, we actually put together a voter communication report on the March primary election on how counties were doing then. Obviously, things have changed, but we think it's really important that information be put out for each election that is accurate in all formats so that people have the most chance to interact with accessible information. 6 counties did have drive-up locations where voters could pick up a ballot, mark in their car, and then drop it in a drop box. We would love to see this expand to the November election as well, and also more counties. We also advocated that voting accommodations, which include voting in person, using an accessible voting machine, etc., should be available during the same 2 to 3 week period that mailed ballots were available. We want people who are voting from home to have the same access as their non-disabled peers so that they can vote and be given time to vote. Okay. So it's really important that we have as many involved people be in current discussions so that voting can remain accessible and to ensure that proper decisions are happening. So the Disability Law Center is working on a few different efforts, and I'll go through those. One which you may or may not heard of is surrounding signature matching. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, it's essentially the process by which when voters sign their ballots, their signature on the ballot is checked against signatures on record. So that's typically on either a driver's license or any sort of ID. But as we know, some people have difficulty writing the same way each time. And that's created in the past a system where it's not uncommon for voters with disabilities to have to go in each election to the clerk's office and sign an affidavit each time their signature doesn't match. We think that that creates an extra hoop for people to jump through, and we're working with the Let Utah Vote Coalition, which includes people like the ACLU, who's spearheading it, and other voting organizations to try to get this process to be standardized and also for there to be options for voters with disabilities not to have to go through this each time. One possible solution would be that a voter file could note that signatures won't match because of a disability, so they don't have to jump through that hoop each time. Essentially, the push of this movement is to get consistency in how counties address signatures. Because right now, each county is kind of allowed to do, to set their own rules as far as how many signatures they'll check, whether they will throw out signatures that don't match, and also how they contact voters that don't have matching signatures. We think consistency is one of the first critical steps in ensuring an equitable process for everyone. Now, one of the areas that I was specifically asked to talk about today was vote at home options. Eric mentioned Votes, which is an online platform that allows people to vote. There was a pilot program run in Utah County, and initially the pilot program was just going to be for people who are overseas, such as military, and we advocated for people with disabilities to be included in that pilot program. They are thinking that they are going to be expanding and continuing this pilot, but I want to make it clear that Votes is not the only option, and that the Disability Law Center does not have a specific stance on which company or which voting system should be used. Instead, we just want to ensure that each voter has equal access to vote privately and independently at home. There's been a variety of different systems that have been experimented on in other states, each with varying success. Some systems include emailing a ballot to voters, having them printed at home, whether they fill it out with their own accessible technology or whether the state helps provide that for them at home. It's different places. That's been a system that has worked. There are online voting platforms that can be used, such as Votes. Davis County here created their own pilot. We're still getting information on that, but at least what they've communicated to us is that they partnered up with some blind individuals to try to make it so that you could print at home. Again, we have no stated preference on which system we think is best, but think it's incredibly important to continue having conversations with voting officials to develop these systems so that people can vote privately and independently at home. The next area that the DLC has been trying to see progress for and hope that you could get involved with is surrounding voter communication. So we actually released, I think in June, a 2020 voter communication report, which was a snapshot of each county's voter communication efforts for the March 3rd, 2020 presidential primary election. Now, we hoped that it would be particularly relevant and help guide all future elections and voter communication. And we think it still can and will. But obviously, some things have changed, like COVID, since the March 3rd presidential primary. So keep that in mind when I'm talking about how this report was set up. You can find it at our website, disabilitylawcenter.org/voting rights. But I've also forwarded to Eric, there are two versions. One is an accessible text format, and the other one includes graphs and images. I would be interested to hear feedback on how the accessible text turned out. I tried to make it as accessible as possible, but I'm certainly no expert and always learning. So if you notice that it does not work for you or doesn't work in particular ways, please reach out to me and let me know so that I can update it and do better in the future. For the report, we wanted to know how are voting options communicated, what information was shared and on what platforms, and are counties using accessible formats. We think that this information could help us push counties to ensure that they are communicating what accommodations are offered and how to access them, because county by county, it can be different and it's allowed to be different, but it's very important that they communicate to their voters what is available so that voters can make the right decision for them and also access what they need to in a timely manner. We want them to include that electronic ballot marking devices are available for people who have a hard time reading or marking a paper ballot, and also what accessible features those include. And also knowing voting options like early voting, same-day voter registration, where vote centers are, and where drop box locations are. With COVID and the changes that there are, we still hope that they're communicating pertinent, relevant information in a timely fashion to voters. So we looked into kind of two areas. We looked on county websites, and we also looked into like print publications. So some of the numbers, I tried to pull out the most significant numbers in my opinion, but there are still more. So I really encourage you to look at the report itself. But a summary of what we found is for county websites, only 17 out of 29 county websites had accurate information about upcoming election dates.
1 minute, Eliza.
Yeah.
You can keep going.
Oh, sorry.
Just giving you 1 minute warning.
Okay, so we'll get through this then. 14 mentioned accurate early voting options or vote center locations, and it gets worse from there. Essentially, they're really bad at communicating any disability information at all. Same with their print publication information. So what can you do? Advocate for your county election officials to ensure that their communications answer 5 basic questions. How do I register? Where can I vote? When can I vote? How can I vote? And who can help? Make sure that you and others are registered to vote as soon as possible. Also, don't forget the census. The census and voting go hand in hand, and there's some information here just about how much money we get from each person who completes the census and also who doesn't. And also, if you have any questions about how to get involved with the causes that I mentioned, any questions about the census or how to vote, where to vote, those types of things, please reach out to Sherry Newton or myself, and I've included our contact information, and we'll answer questions later on.
Thanks, Eliza. And in case you guys are wondering, the resources that Eliza has provided is actually on the chat box if you guys want to take a look at that as well. So with that, now let's turn the time over to our next panelist, Gina Pola-Money. Gina?
Okay, I'm going to try to get my slides up. Okay, can you see those or is it not showing them? Okay. Okay, the Mac's not working with this. I am so sorry. See if I can. Okay, I'll go ahead in the interest of time and try to play with it as we go. If not, I'll make sure that the slides are uploaded for Eric and the Developmental Disability Council to share afterwards. So my presentation is advocacy, 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 and not necessarily in that order. It's an action we can all take to influence positive changes by voting. So I'm Gina Money. I'm the current chair of the Legislative Coalition for People with Disabilities, otherwise known as the LCPD. And since its inception in 1981, the LCPD has advocated for public policy affecting all people in Utah who have disabilities. Services for people with disabilities have emerged because of grassroots advocacy by people with disabilities, their families, friends, and caring professionals. The results of advocacy have been encouraging in the past, but the battles guaranteeing the rights of individuals with disabilities are far from over. So the LCPD focuses on state and local issues in elections, but we know the outcome of the presidential election directly impacts state budgets and decisions. I've heard from many colleagues and friends, read many articles in literature, and also believe through my own research that the upcoming elections are one of the most important in our lifetime. If you're not a member of the LCPD, you can sign up on the website, which is lcpdut.org. So the Americans with Disabilities Act just celebrated their 30th anniversary. And before that, people with disabilities didn't have the same rights as everybody else, as you know, including the right to vote. So when it was passed 3 decades ago, it was one of the most important pieces of legislation ever for children, youth, and individuals with disabilities. The ADA guaranteed the rights of people with disabilities without discrimination to access everything that everyone else does, including the right to vote. This includes the necessary accommodations to help people physically access polling locations. Though this legislation was passed 30 years ago, we all know and recognize that there are still huge barriers to access many things, including the right to vote. Some of the barriers facing Americans with disabilities include inaccessible polling locations, non-working voting machines, and people that are not trained to help individuals with disabilities vote independently. So one of the facts that is not a myth is that there are approximately 61 million people in the United States that have disabilities. And that number is growing rapidly as we have an aging population, and we also make up the largest minority group. Disability is a natural part of the human experience. This is huge, as the saying goes, nothing about us without us. Even the barriers we or our family members still face, the biggest victory we can all have is to get out and vote in whatever way we can. Utah has some things in place that are helpful, as was just mentioned, in hoping to get that, early access to vote, same day registration, and voting with all mail-in vote, which will help especially during this pandemic, also known as COVID-19 or the coronavirus, so that people that have underlying health conditions don't have to expose themselves to the risk of the virus. But this has come a long way, but it still does not help all of our community, such as individuals with low vision or who are blind that need additional accommodations to have their right to vote by accessing machines in person that are specific to the needs of their disability. A survey done by the Government Accountability Office during the last presidential election stated that only 17% of the polling sites had completely barrier-free access, which means we were not in full compliance of the ADA. With that said, we all have much more advocacy to do to make sure we all have our full rights, and the way to do that is to raise above the barriers and figure out how to get everyone out to vote in whatever way possible so that our voices are truly heard and counted, because our services, supports, and livelihoods depend on it. A quote from Michelle Bishop, who works on voter access initiatives for the National Disability Rights Network, states, "It's not right that there are voters with disabilities who have to advocate for themselves to be able to cast their ballots accessibly, privately, and independently. But we got to go and do what we have to do, because if we want to see real change, and I hope that everyone will cast their ballots this November." So as experts with lived experience and knowledge, we all have a responsibility to engage in policy and systems change by voting. We don't realize that Your potential influence is far greater than you think. And voting, we know, won't guarantee a win for our specific candidate that we're voting for, but not voting guarantees that your voice won't be known or heard. Your only task is to be yourself, a citizen and a voter who wants all policies to work for individuals with disabilities and their families. So why vote? Again, because empowering each other to participate in their rights to vote in itself is a victory, regardless of the outcome. And know the issues that are important to you. You live in the day in the life. You only know what needs you have to successfully do whatever it is that you are seeking. And democracy is not a spectator sport. There's so many times that I hear, well, my vote doesn't count. But if you start counting up all of the people that feel that way and haven't been educated about how important their vote is, then of course that vote's not going to count. But can you only imagine if all of those people that said that do that, their voices would be heard. So people with disabilities and their families are born leaders. And one of the greatest leadership activities is to vote and get others on board to know how important their voice is by voting. Regardless of people's choices in candidates or parties, the best way to be an informed voter is to do the research and find out how their candidates vote on issues, funding, and laws that directly impact our community. It is important to get the real facts and know how to make sure information is credible. Talk to your networks and disability organizations to gain and spread the wealth of knowledge. I have included a link, which hopefully I can get at, that has actually a voting checklist of what polling sites should have in place for accessibility to help individuals and families know what to advocate for in all elections now and in the future to make sure the right to vote is there for everyone. Thank you for allowing me to share some quick information on the importance of the ADA and what rights it really truly gave us as individuals with disabilities and our family members, and why it's so important to vote. Our lives and our loved ones' lives and our community depend on it. So with some of those pieces to talk about and get a network going, talk to specific disability groups or organizations, call the Utah Parent Center. And of course, as the Disability Law Center talked about all of their initiatives and projects, and as well as contacting, of course, the Utah Developmental Disabilities Council and the Centers for Persons with Disabilities. So thank you, and I'll wait for questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Gina. And so now I'd like to turn the time over to our final panelist for today, Seth Anderson. Seth?
Great, thank you, Eric. Can everyone hear me? Awesome. Well, that was excellent, Gina and Eliza. Thank you both for discussing such important issues. And also thanks, Eric and Avery, for organizing this. I think it's a tremendous opportunity, not only for me to talk about elections, which I love doing, but also for me to learn from your organization and the Utah DD Council and learn about ways that we can function better in our office. So a little bit about me and my office. I work as an election specialist in the Utah Lieutenant Governor's office. Some people ask, how can the Utah Lieutenant Governor run an election and it'd be a partisan office? And the short answer for that is basically that Utah does not have a Secretary of State office. There are some statutory duties that would in many other states fall to a Secretary of State that fall to the Utah Lieutenant Governor's office, elections administration being one of them. We also, in our office, administer lobbyist code. So if you have a PAC or you're doing any lobbying or any sort of financial contributions, that is run through our office. We also do a few other things that I don't really work directly on. We administer notary law, also incorporations, as well as annexations. So it's kind of mixed bag here in the office, but it's fun, and the elections part is always exciting, always things to change and improve upon. So I put together a few slides, nothing too extensive, but I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss why the 2020 vote matters, and also changes to voter registration for 2020. So let me see if I can get this pulled up. Okay. All right, so for the November election, I'm sure everyone knows that we've got a big election coming up. Every 4 years, we have a presidential election. So just to kind of break it down, I like to look at it as we have basically 3 buckets of elections going on in November. We have federal, state, and local and county elections that we'll be voting on. For federal, as we all know, President of the United States is up for election, and all 4 Utah congressional districts. We do not have any U.S. Senate elections happening this year. The next one will be in 2022. So be on the lookout for that. No congressional or no Senate election this year. For state, we have all statewide offices. So governor, attorney general, auditor, and treasurer. We have all 75 Utah House districts on the ballot, and we have 15 Senate districts. So that's 15 out of 29 Senate districts. We have 8 state school board, or excuse me, 8 state board of education districts up for election. That's 8 out of 15. We have 8 constitutional amendments on the ballot. And then we also have judicial retention elections. So a little bit about the constitutional amendments. A lot of people thought that we might see some ballot propositions. If anyone can remember, it feels like forever ago, but we had the tax referendum that was likely going to appear on the ballot. They actually gathered enough signatures, but the legislature went ahead and changed that law. So we will not see that on the ballot this year, and we don't have any other ballot propositions. Judicial retention elections, basically we'll have, I believe, 1 state Supreme Court justice is up for retention, and then we have a lot of other smaller courts, justice courts, and then some local courts that will be on the ballot. Some of those judges will have retention elections. And then at the local and county level, we will have county positions. So that's county commission, county mayor, or county executive. We will have positions like county assessor, recorder, surveyor, and treasurer on the ballot. And then also local school board elections will be happening. And finally, there will be ballot propositions at the local level as well as bonds. So that might not apply to your area, but let's say your community is looking at a RAP tax, which stands for Recreation, Arts, and can't recall what the P is for, but recreation, if they want to build a new recreation center, or if there's a bond that's being proposed to potentially put money into new school facilities or roads or anything like that, that could be on your ballot at the local level. So it's easy to say that there's a lot on the ballot this year. So voter registrations in 2020, there hasn't been a ton. The one thing that I believe Eliza touched on was the 11-day registration requirement. So prior to 2020, there were various different registration deadlines based off of whether you were registering online or in person or by mail. In March, the legislature passed a bill that changed that to just one deadline, which is 11 days prior to Election Day. The easy way to remember that is Friday, October 23rd, 2020. the registration does need to be received by 5 p.m. So that's a little bit tricky because we think about vote by mail and we say, okay, well, we've got, postmark deadlines for our ballots. The registration is a little bit more specific. It does need to be received by 5 p.m. So let's say you mailed in your registration on Wednesday, October 23rd or October 21st. You'd really want to make sure that it was received in the county clerk's office by that 5 p.m. deadline on Friday. So 11 days, pretty easy to remember. Different ways to register, vote.utah.gov. That's where we point everybody. If you have a Utah identification or Utah driver's license, vote.utah.gov is likely going to be the quickest way to register. We also have a paper form. We get a lot of people who are moving to Utah and they say, I don't have a driver's license or identification card yet. What do I do? The option that we point those voters towards is the paper registration form. You can use the last 4 digits of your social security number to register that way. The final way that you can register is in person at the county clerk's office. I know that we are in a pandemic, so business hours and state office hours aren't as consistent as they had been in the past. So if you are planning on going to a county clerk's office to register in person, I would recommend giving them a call beforehand, finding out what their hours are, if they're normal. But that's a great way to register because you can go in, provide your identification. If you need to give them a utility bill to show your address, you can take care of that all in one swoop right there at the clerk's office. So what will voting look like in November? I really wish that we were having this conversation in 2 weeks. The reason being, I think as Eliza mentioned also, the legislature will be meeting very soon. That date is, I believe, set for August 20th. And among other things, they will be discussing election changes. So my message here is I wouldn't put it in pen. It's all in pencil because this is all subject to change. But there's a few things that I do want to highlight that aren't going to change. The first one is the election will be by mail. We still get questions in our office. How do I request a mail ballot? Will I get my ballot by mail? And I think that this group is pretty knowledgeable about voting. And you probably know that all active registered Utah voters will receive a by mail ballot. Now, of course, that wasn't true for the primary election because the primary election is partisan based. So if you were a registered Democrat, registered Republican, or a different party that was holding a primary election, you would have received a ballot. The November election is different. All registered voters automatically receive a by mail ballot. So when will those ballots go out? The way it's set in statute right now is they will be mailed from the clerk's office between October 13th and October 20th. This could change. I know that some of the clerks are asking the legislature to potentially bump this up a week, give the USPS a little bit more latitude for getting those ballots out in time. So we could see that time frame change a little bit. But as it stands right now, most Utah voters can expect to see their ballots hit the mailbox shortly after October 13th. Another thing, so as it stands right now for in-person voting, the current law is that counties do have to have in-person voting. It seems like the appetite from the legislature is to have increased in-person voting compared to the June 30th primary election. I don't know if anybody experienced drive-up voting. It seemed like the counties that were holding drive-up voting, it went relatively smoothly, but at the same time, there does seem to be an appetite for just regular brick and mortar, walk in, be able to get a ballot and vote right there. So I'm predicting, don't quote me on this, that there will be more in-person voting. The other thing I wanted to mention was postmarking ballots. I touched on this earlier, but right now in statute, the ballot must be postmarked the day before the election. So as it stands in statute right now, that's November 2nd. This was different for the June 30th primary, and I hate to get too into the weeds on this, but the legislature did change the postmark deadline for the June 30th primary to election day. So you could submit your ballot to the United States Postal Service on June 30th up until 8 p.m. and still have your vote count. There's some murmurs that will be the case for the November 3rd election, but I just want to say right now that hasn't changed yet, and the postmark deadline is the day before the election.
Go back with the people.
Oops, sorry about that. Okay. Sounds like there will be early in-person voting for most counties right now. It is up to the county to determine what in-person voting will look like, but the date for in-person early voting is October 20th through the 30th. So if you're thinking about voting early in person, I would advise you to reach out to your clerk's office and find out what those dates look like and if this is accurate. Also, some counties like Salt Lake and some of the other Wasatch Front counties will do voting on the Monday before the election. So November 2nd could be an option as well. Same day in-person registration, we expect that to be much more possible for the November 3rd election. I think that was a big frustration amongst voters for the June 30th primary. You don't really have to think too hard to know why that's a popular option amongst voters to be able to register on the same day of the election and be able to vote. So we do expect in-person voting and for same-day registration to be possible on election day. And as always, all of this is a big asterisk. Whenever we speak with a voter with disabilities, we really encourage them to communicate directly with their clerk's office. Clerk's office can arrange specific accommodations and give them far better directions than our office is necessarily able to give based off of a statewide perspective. Another thing that I very quickly wanted to mention that is one of our office's projects is what we call Campus Cup. It's a friendly competition amongst Utah colleges and universities to encourage voter registration, participation, and voter knowledge. If you are involved at a university or a campus, or you know somebody that is, I would really encourage you to reach out to me, and I've got my contact information at the end of this presentation about how to get involved with this. I think it's a really, really cool project and gets younger Utahns elections and gives them a platform to communicate to their peers. Okay, thank you. Communicate to their peers what's going on with election, how to register, and figure out who the candidates are and get more information on it. So if you have any questions about that or want to learn more about the Campus Cup competition, absolutely reach out to me, and I would be very eager to get you in touch with someone on your campus to help you get involved. So just a few questions that we get. I talked about this earlier. Party affiliation does not matter for the general election, unlike the primary election. How do I find out more about the candidates or anything on the ballot? We steer all our voters to vote.utah.gov. You can type in your address and see exactly what your ballot is going to look like and start researching the candidates as well as constitutional amendments, things of that nature right on that site. Finally, getting involved. We always get questions about people wanting to be poll workers or election judges. And we really encourage this. I think it's one of the ways that we can really get people more engaged in the election process. Reach out to your county clerk's office. There are so many opportunities for everyday Utah voters to get involved and help out and do really good work in making sure that our democratic processes work effectively. So if you need to find out a county clerk's contact information, again, reach out to me. I'd be happy to put you in touch with a clerk's office. So that's all I have. With that, I will yield the rest of my time and questions at the end.
Great, thank you so much, Seth. Now it's time for our question and answer period. We're going to answer the chat questions really quick first. Our first question we have is from Jennifer. She asks, what legislation is coming on the special session and how will it impact voting access?
So I suppose I could speak to that. So the big ones that we're looking at right now, and again, I hate to put any words in the mouths of the legislators because this is all very subject to change, but the postmark deadline, the counties choosing how to deliver in-person voting, whether that's going to be brick and mortar voting or drive-up voting. I think the legislation that comes out of August 20th will discuss those two issues, absolutely. And then also just shifting those dates around a little bit. I think we will see either by mail ballots going out before the election or before the time period that I described earlier. Also the canvass date. I think that's one that we could see change. Canvassing, if you're not aware, basically it's how the counties count ballots and determine who won a race. Typically, they have 2 weeks after an election to count those ballots. They may add an additional week on there. So we may not see elections certified by the counties for up to 3 weeks after the election. So that's a great question. And I think in Utah, we're pretty used to vote by mail and not knowing exactly who won election night, but I know that there's a lot of buzz nationally that we may not know what the outcomes of the election are on November 3rd, and that could continue. So I think those three things will be likely legislative issues.
Great. So our next question is from Avery. Avery says, what can people do if they find their voting place is not accessible?
I think that one is probably directed at me. So if they find that their voting place is inaccessible, that might happen in a few different ways. One, that could mean that the building is inaccessible. Two, that can either mean architecturally or just somebody put a garbage can in front of a ramp or a vote here sign in front of the doorway. That happens frequently. Or that means that perhaps a voting machine is locked up in the back and nobody knows where a key is. That also happens. Or that a poll worker is denying somebody access. We saw that happen in March, where somebody was told that they couldn't vote because they were blind. Those are all different forms of inaccessibility. Each one has kind of similar answer, which is to contact the Disability Law Center, and we can kind of help walk it through specifically if it's something like moving a sign or a garbage can out of the way. That can usually be dealt with same day. If it's, we don't generally see a lot of architecturally inaccessible buildings unless, for example, an elevator went down on election day. That can be a little bit trickier, but we could contact the polling place and ask them to move where you vote into an accessible location. With poll workers, we can help instruct people on what their rights are and ensure that they are able to inform the poll worker that they should be able to vote. But sometimes some issues we aren't able to deal with same day because it's more complex. And then we can do a more legal complaint. But short answer is just contact us and we'll walk you through it.
Eliza, will you please put that phone number in the chat?
Yes, I will do that.
If I could just add to that, I think that's great advice, Eliza. If anybody is receiving pushback at the county level or is having issues at the county level, we always encourage you to reach out to our office at the Lieutenant Governor's office, and sometimes we can work quickly to resolve an issue where a voter's running into some sort of problem. So just also have that number in your tool belt.
All right, so we have a question from Everett. Everett, do you have a question?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. My question is regarding the Votes app, which I know Eliza has a little bit of information on. I know what's going on in Utah County, and maybe Seth could also answer a little bit of this. I'm wondering if what the plan is in place to expand this to other counties. I know the Republican primary used it for their convention and other things. So, and it seems to be widely liked by a lot of folks out there. And then there's also Democracy Live, which is another option. But I'm wondering, is that what are we looking at for expansion of these online balloting approaches?
Do you want to take that one, Eliza, or?
You're probably better suited for at least expansion across Utah.
Okay, yeah, and my sense is that this was somewhat of a pilot program that was authorized by the legislature. I'd have to do a little bit more research on it, but I think that expansion could happen. More counties could allow for increased online voting, increased app voting, things of that nature. But I don't quote me on this. I do want to say that it was somewhat of a pilot program that would need more of a statutory change by the legislature to bring it to any sort of statewide level. I'd be happy to do some more research. So if you wanted to send me an email, I could locate those code sections and get those back to you.
Yeah, Seth, this is Everett Bacon. I'd be happy to do that for you. And I can even get you in more information about how counties can apply for a free grant that would allow them to utilize the online balloting services all the way up to 2024.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that information and we can communicate it to the counties. As I'm sure many of you are aware, a lot of elections are administered at the local level. A lot of the decisions are made by county clerks and county elections offices. And while my office, we do administer elections on the state level, the counties do have a lot of freedom to use programs like votes or adopt things like ranked choice voting, things of that nature. Whereas our office, the Lieutenant Governor's office, is a little limited in telling counties you should do this, you shouldn't do that. But yeah, Everett, I'd be happy to talk with you further after the call.
All right, thank you, Seth.
Thanks.
All right, so I just got so we have 5 more minutes left. We have one more question. And Kelly, you said in the chat you had a question. What's your question? Hold on, she's gonna get it real quick.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, my question is I know everybody is scared about this COVID thing, but I was just thinking why we can't vote in person, because there's people said you can't vote in person. Well, there's people out there, not everywhere, and especially in Utah. There is some protesters, and then there's some of us are going to Walmart, and some have their mask on, and some are standing back like 6 feet, and then also the school is going to start soon in different areas. So I'm just curious about that. If we could, that's one of my questions.
I can talk about that a little bit on kind of what we hear at our office, Kelly. I think that you're raising a really valid point. And I think that the legislature, and again, I don't want to put words in their mouths, but I think back in March, when a lot of the decisions were being made, March and April, about how the June 30th primary election would be administered, we knew very little about COVID-19. And I think it's arguable that we still know a limited amount about COVID-19. That being said, I think that you're totally right, and the legislature would agree that in-person voting is desired by Utah voters. And I think that we will see the legislation that comes out of August 20th special session reflect that desire.
So is that Seth?
This is Seth, yes.
Hey,
So are you going to be there and talk to him about what I said and so forth?
Unfortunately, I don't really have much sway over how the legislature determines things. They basically pass bills and things are signed into law, and my office pretty much administers those laws. I would really encourage all of you to reach out to your state senator, to your state representative, and say, hey, this is how I feel about this issue. I think that's much more effective than me personally from my elections office to be communicating with the legislators. So give them time to express that.
Hey, Alec, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Tamara. We're almost out of time. What's your question?
I don't have a question. I was just gonna make a quick comment. I think that people with disabilities should not be able to go in the voting floor because of COVID, and people with disabilities should vote from the mail and not get sick, because if they get sick, then that's a whole nother issue.
That is a good comment, Tamara. And it's almost 1 o'clock. I just wanted to say thank you all so much for attending our webinar today. And I want to say thank you to Eliza, Gina, and Seth for being our panelists for today and taking time out of their busy schedules. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the afternoon. And for those of you out there who didn't get a chance to witness the webinar, we have this recorded live, and you guys can watch it as soon as we get edits done on this. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.